What's up guys, it's River, and today we're looking at the Canon EOS RP. The RP definitely stands for reasonably priced. When this camera first came out, everybody, and I mean everybody, just completely dismissed it, took a crap on it, was just nah. This is a full frame camera that makes a lot of sense for a lot of people, plus a very specific niche audience that I think unfortunately might dismiss this camera, but hopefully they watch this review. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the specs of this Canon camera. And when you discuss a Canon camera, it's honestly like talking about a fine wine, because there's so many like unseen details about these cameras that people just tend to overlook. So first things first, it has a 26.2 megapixel sensor. I believe it is the exact same sensor that comes out of the 60 Mark II. That is also a good full frame camera, but I think I'd prefer this one over that, but we'll talk about that later. As for photos, it does 5 frames per second, which is not very fast. That is pedestrian at best. However, it only does 5 frames per second in single shot. In continuous focus, where it's just tracking your subject, it does 2.5 shots. That is slow. If I gave my grandmother a painting or like chalk or whatever, she could paint faster than this camera shoots. The next thing to note is that this camera does full HD in 24 and 30. When this camera first came out, one of the reasons people dismissed it was because it did not do 24 frames per second, but now, thanks to firmware, so if you buy this camera, you will have to do a quick firmware update, but it now shoots 24 frames per second. Thank you. It also does 4K at 24, but the 4K in this camera sucks. It has so much rolling shutter. It's not quite as sharp. Like these lenses, the RF lenses, we'll talk more about those later, are super sharp. Like if you have the opportunity to switch from the L series to the R, matters is their color science. To kind of reiterate, what I think makes this camera really special is the fact that you have such a cheap entry point into the Canon ecosystem. You're telling me I can get Canon colors, Canon photo, Canon HD for $1,000, and with all the money that I save by only spending $1,000 on my body, I can buy really nice lenses, really nice flashes, really nice lights, really nice modifiers. Yeah, this camera is a steal as long as you don't need high frame rates. And if you do need high frame rates, Canon 60 Mark II is slightly faster than this camera and is about the same price. Which brings me to my next point. One of the things that I really appreciate about having a Canon mirrorless camera is the fact that I have access to the RF line. If you don't know what the RF line is, this is Canon's new lens line. The L series, which is like generally their professional line, this is the update to that. So what they've done is remove the optical block at the back of this that you normally need for DSLRs. And naturally, by removing that optical block, you're getting a sharper image, you're getting a faster lens in most cases, and best of all, it's cheaper. Although these lenses are very expensive, but I can only imagine how much more expensive they would have been in the past. And a quick thing to note about Canon cameras and Canon lenses, Canon cameras do not have any IBIS, in-body stabilization. They do have some sort of digital stabilization, and how do I say this politely? It is worse than Vin Diesel movies. It is just terrible. However, the lenses themselves have pretty decent stabilization. It's not as good as like Sony IBIS, which is just flawless. However, personally, and this is just personally, I will take Canon colors over Sony IBIS any day, so something to note. So next, let's talk about autofocus in this camera. The autofocus in this camera is reliable as hell. I'm kind of in love. I really like the Sony autofocus, but there's a few things I like about this camera better. Sony has really, really good autofocus and super just fast and reliable. However, it's too machine-like. Like when you pull from subject to subject, you can tell that's like zzz, zzz, and that was a computer that did that. What I prefer about the dual pixel autofocus is that it's still very reliable, it's still very fast, like it's really great, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a difference. But when you go from subject to subject, it's a very smooth pull, and there's menus in the camera that help you adjust that pull to make sure it's very smooth. And that really matters if you're shooting a documentary with this, some sort of short narrative piece, run and gun stuff, or even if you're just like with family and just shooting around, like you don't want to have that zzz, zzz look. I hate that look. So that's one thing I really appreciate about the dual pixel autofocus, that it's very human-like and it takes that mechanical edge off your focus. And as for like the actual quality of it, it's very fast, very reliable, really robust autofocus system. This camera also has face detect and eye detect, and it's phenomenal. Face detect and eye detect as a technology overall are pretty much good in everything. But what I really appreciate about this camera, it does this thing where when you're looking at someone's face, it will be in eye detect mode, and as soon as you turn away, it'll go into tracking mode, and other cameras do that, but I find the Canon cameras do that just a little bit better. than other cameras. And I would say it's neck and neck with Sony, but I think I just prefer the Canon cameras. Personal opinion. And another thing that I think is going to be a huge issue for a lot of you guys, it is for me, is the fact that this camera doesn't have a shutter flap that comes down when it's off. So if you know anything about mirrorless cameras, they're super prone to dust and dirt because there's nothing covering the sensor, and just anytime you open it up or stuff gets in, you'll get dirt on your sensor. And especially because on a mirrorless camera, the flange is very short. If you shoot on anything above like f5 or f6, that dirt will show up on your camera and it ruins your image. So yeah, that's a huge deal. And also this camera is in weather sealed. So if you're somebody that travels a lot, goes to really challenging environments where there's a lot of dust, sand, and grit, yeah, this camera will break on you. Do not take this. It's not weather sealed, doesn't cover the sensor. You will break your camera. But the EOS R, the full version, that's I think about $700 more, is weather sealed, has a shutter flap and all that, and you're good to go. But if you're someone that's just shooting in the city and you're not taking it to particularly challenging environments, most likely you won't have an issue, and you just have to be extra careful about keeping that sensor clean, because getting dust on your sensor is just something that all mirrorless cameras deal with. One of the reasons I switched out of Sony into RED cameras was because my sensor just kept getting dirty. And if you're a studio photographer, most of that probably doesn't mean anything to you. Just make sure to keep that sensor clean. Next, let's talk about design on this camera, because one of the biggest selling points when it comes to Canon cameras especially is the design. They are so easy to use, they're so easy to work with, and honestly, I think I'm about 45 to 50% faster with a Canon camera, and that's quite a lot. So right off the bat, the build quality on this camera is the first thing you notice. Holding this camera, it honestly doesn't feel like a DSLR. Like a Canon EOS, like DSLR with the little flippy mirrors, yeah, it felt like a camera. It felt like a work thing. This thing feels like a luxury toy or like a high-end watch. It's got this smooth, anodized finish. It's like matte. It honestly feels like Batman's camera, but just the paint job on this camera itself is so pretty. Matte finish. It's got this nice rubberized grip all the way around. I mean, that grip isn't gonna do that much, but it's just nice to have. A lot of what Canon does with their cameras is that they're fun to use, and it's a good user experience, so you never dread using their equipment. That's one of the best things about Canon cameras. Next, let's talk about software. Now, Canon menus and just the overall interface is super easy to use, mainly because there's not that much to it. The menus are only like 4 or 5 pages. There's only 3 or 4 tabs in there. If you go through Sony menus, like I kid you not, there is somebody out there that could do a PhD in how to properly use Sony menus. There's so many of them, and there's so many options in Sony cameras that like to this day, I don't know what to do. And I own an A7 III and an A7S. There's just so many options. But with Canon cameras, it's easy to use. I always feel like I've picked up the same camera before. The menus are just intuitive and easy to use. I genuinely feel like I could give my mom, who's like in her 50s, is like a total like non-tech person, and she could easily figure out the camera. It's one of those cameras you can give to your parents and they're fine. They're not confused. They're not like, how do I get the megapixels in the thing? That's what my parents sound like. But design-wise, it's a flawless camera. It's well built. Build quality is really well done. Software, phenomenal. The touchscreen on the back of this camera and just going through daily operations with this camera, super easy to use. I recommend this camera to anybody. You will not have a problem. However, there is one slight issue that I should mention when it comes to design. I don't think most of you guys will care, but the SD card goes in the bottom. So if you got to put your SD card in here, that's usually not a problem because manufacturers for tripods and rigs are kind of privy to that being a thing. And most manufacturers will actually build their tripod heads and their camera cages in a way that you can easily access this. But for some people, and especially professionals, I know that they want the SD card on the side, so that might be a deal breaker for you. Personally, I do not care. While we're on the topic of design, I should mention batteries. Now, this is not the usual Canon LP6 battery that lasts forever and ever, and those batteries are about 2200 milliamp hours, which is about the same size as your iPhone battery. This is, however, roughly 1000 milliamp battery, and it's more so the battery you see in Canon's compact and mirrorless line. This camera, I wouldn't say has bad battery life, but it's not exceptional. It's definitely better than the Sony batteries, which only last about 40 minutes. I feel like you can get through about half a day of shooting or video on a single battery. You're definitely gonna need to have spares. Like, there's no scenario out there where you're not gonna have spare batteries, but I don't think the battery life is that much of an issue as people make it out to be. I would give the battery 7.5 out of 10. Decent. And now, I think I've said enough nice things about this camera. Let's talk about the bad, because it's definitely not a perfect camera. No camera is, but this camera has some interesting drawbacks. So this camera's gotten a lot of flack for things like bad dynamic range, low light performance and all that, and none of those things are true, but they also kind of are true. And this is something that I noticed right away about this camera because of my film background where I shot on 35mm film, and just like most video cameras work like this. What I think this camera is doing is it's got a native ISO of somewhere between 850 to 1000, and what's happening is when people shoot in really low ISOs with this camera, like 100, 200, what this camera is doing is it's clipping all of your shadows. So if you try to bring up that information later, basically if you try to brighten your image and it's kind of dark, you're just getting tons of noise, there's no information there, and you're kind of screwed. Really, the issue comes down to if your image is dark, you can brighten it up. There's information in the highlights. But if your image is too dark, you cannot brighten it up. Once your blacks are black, that information is gone. It kind of has a bonus because comparing the footage from this camera to like a Sony camera, the blacks are much, like very rich in this camera. Just the contrast values are better with whatever they're doing with this camera. But I can see how people would see that as bad dynamic range, and yeah, I can see that being a drawback. So if you are gonna get this camera, do one of these two things. Either shoot a little bit brighter than you have to, or shoot exactly what you want in post. And that can be a bit difficult if you plan to grade your image heavily and kind of push-pull colors. So at the end of the day, who's this camera really for? Because obviously it's not like the most powerful camera, it doesn't shoot very fast, the 4K is pretty much unusable. But I think what really matters is the HD works really well. The photos out of this camera work really well because of the color science. You have a 26 megapixel sensor, so you can crop in a little bit without losing too much detail. This camera makes a lot of sense for someone that's a beginner studio photographer where it's like you don't have a ton of money to spend on your camera. You're just doing a lot of like slow moving fashion photography, this camera would be great. If you're someone that just does portraits and, you know, for portraits, no one's really moving around a lot, this camera would be great. And honestly, like if you're doing portraits, you probably don't even need a faster camera. Like 5 frames per second in single focus mode is totally fine. So really, I think this camera works for indie filmmakers, young DPs, young portrait and studio photographers that don't need a lot of movement. Because if anything, you can be a really high level professional. As long as you don't need a lot of movement, this camera will be just fine. And wedding guys, that's probably an audience that I should talk more to, but wedding guys, like most wedding guys, I don't see them using 120 frames per second a lot because it's just so slow and so boring. 60 frames per second in this camera is more than good enough. I don't think I've ever had a wedding client, though I don't really shoot weddings, be like, I need 4K or 6K video. You're good with the HD, your turnaround's fast, you've got great colors, you barely need to finesse your footage. And you know, weddings and corporate guys, you guys could both really use this camera. The person that I would not recommend this camera to is street photographers, low light photographers, and sports photographers. Street photographers, you guys need a lot of flexibility with your image. And just the fact that this camera, like, you know, you got exposed to the right, make it a bit brighter than that, like, nah, none of that noise. Like you, street photographers, you're catching things in the moment. Like it's just bang, 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 going off. And if you're a street photographer, this camera doesn't make sense for you because you need a camera with a lot of flexibility. And you're gonna be finessing your colors, so a Sony makes a lot more sense. The autofocus is way faster, way more resolution, you can really finesse your colors, just Sony makes more sense for you. Or like the Ryko GR3, that makes a lot of sense for you guys. And if you're just a low light shooter, I just don't think this camera makes sense for low light because of that fixed dynamic range where it shows more in the highlights than the shadows. Just, nah, this camera doesn't make sense. And one last thing, I do recommend this camera for vlogging and content creators. This is quite the camera. You're getting a high megapixel sensor, great colors, great video, all that good stuff. It's got the little tilty flippy screen and bam, you can see yourself. This is phenomenal if you're a content creator that's like vlogging, making Instagram content, going out to TikTok, like just do some vertical action here. But yeah, overall, this is a very good content creator camera. And lastly, these are the people that I think will sadly overlook this camera, but I think this camera is perfect. Most people don't know, but I actually used to work in VFX. I used to work for a really big VFX studio here in Toronto, and we did a lot of movies that, trust me, you've seen these movies in theaters. But one thing that I realized was that a lot of like the set props that we built that were all digital, and a lot of like the VFX that we built that were all digital, or any of the location scouting that we did that later got turned into a digital asset, were all shot on like these Canon cameras. And the truth is, like, when you're a VFX guy or you're a location scout for a film, you don't need a lot of frame rates, but you do need to bring back badass photos to the director. You do need to bring back really good photos. Like, a cell phone will not cut it. So if I was a location scout today or a VFX supervisor today, I would get my crew like 4 of these cameras. Like, the lenses don't particularly matter because you're just using these images for references. But if I could buy 4 or 5 of these cameras for $1,000 a pop, put just like serviceable lenses on here and get back really high resolution photos for my VFX team, that would make a ton of sense. And I think the VFX industry will most likely overlook this, but if you're a VFX guy that follows me, get this camera, man. If I was a VFX guy today, I would definitely be using this camera. Or a red, which is actually why I have my red. It's because I do a lot of VFX.